Which test? Okay, mine's on.
Okay, let's try this one. Yeah, that's much better.
Hey, did you leave your opening statement right here where I can read along? I won't have to take any notes.
Actually, it's your copy. You can have it. You can borrow it.
All right.
Make some notes. I'd love to read it later.
Safe space in my notebook.
Okay. All right, so thank you, Dr. Rochlow, Patrick, Connor, all the sponsors for making this debate possible. I know how hard it is to put a debate like this on. It wasn't but a year and a half ago that I was introducing Matt on this very stage, along with Dr. John Ferrer, on the existence of God. So I'm a philosopher, and 15-minute opening statements, that's not a lot of time for philosophers to talk, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I also thank all of you for being out here on such a beautiful day. So in my initial preparation for this debate, I was going to try to argue for two basic contentions. The first was, our beliefs are proportional to the degree of warrant that we have for a given belief. And second, belief in God can be and is highly warranted. Now, when I wrote all of this down, and I tried to say it all in 15 minutes, it took me 15 minutes just to explain the nature of warrant. So I had to cut a lot of that out. So tonight's question is, should you believe in God? But before I answer if you should believe in God, it may be helpful to answer why I believe in God. And it's actually one of the number one questions that Matt asked on his show, The Atheist Experience. Why do you believe what you believe? Well, I grew up in a wonderful, loving, single mother home. And I went to a kind of old school church. Women wore head coverings, long dresses, not permitted to speak when the service started. And just as many children do, in fact I would say all children, I formed my beliefs based somewhat on the nature of my own experience, as well as what my parents told me and what people that I loved and trusted. And so long as those things remain reliable, or through some other test, that's what I believed. So some of the things that I've been taught, I was taught to believe in God. Grew up in a Christian home, as I said, going to church every Sunday and Wednesday and whole weeks during revivals and things of that nature. I came at the age of 9 years old. I decided that hell was terrifying, and I wanted to escape the hellfires of hell damnation and all that sort of thing. So I decided I was going to get saved, and I was going to get baptized, and that was going to be it for me. Well, so I held those beliefs until about the time I came 15 years old, and I had my first kind of worldview changing bit of doubt. Matt, you'll love this. I had a doctrinal disagreement with the church that I was at. Some of the things that they taught I didn't necessarily agree with, and I tried to refute it. And it was not an environment that was very conducive to asking questions, and I didn't receive answers that I was particularly satisfied with. So as I developed cognitively, I developed reading, reasoning abilities, and started questioning a lot of the other things that I had been taught. And as I continued, I learned more and more, reasoned more and more, and started to reject more and more of the beliefs of my childhood. So I don't want to mislead you or lie to you. I was never an atheist, but I did identify as an agnostic. I wasn't sure whether or not I believed in God. I was actually at a point where I didn't know if it was possible whether or not we could believe in God. But I've always sort of had this odd feeling that there was something bigger than myself, but of course that doesn't arrive at some sort of belief in God. This was important because I had never seriously considered the nature of God, and I didn't really know what God was. But of course, as many of you in here, my mom made me go to church. So I went to what I thought was the most liberal church in town, First Baptist Clarksville. Yeah, I know, right? So my mom made me go to church, but at that point, I just sat in the back, played video games on my phone. Religion just really wasn't part of my life. Fast forward, get out of high school, I immediately became an emergency medical technician. I worked for a private service for about a year and a half, and I dealt with some loss, but nothing like my very first day working for Montgomery County EMS. My very first day on my first field training officer ride, I dealt with the incident involving the suicide of a friend of mine. And it only got better after that. I dealt with probably more death, dying, pain, and suffering than anybody should ever have to endure. And looking at the question of belief in God, nobody comes at it from a blank slate. You come at it from your background. So of course, my starting point was what my parents believed, what my coworkers believed. So what I saw is if there is some sort of all-powerful, all-loving God, why do I have to deal with some of these things that I have to deal with in EMS? And if I see a child drowning in front of me, I'm a good person. If I had the power to save it, I would. Why doesn't God? It didn't make sense to me, so I wanted to figure out the answer to that question. Well, the people that answer that sort of question are apologists, coming from the Greek word apologia, which means to make a defense. So I came up across people like John Lennox, Alvin Plantinga, William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and tons of others. And pretty early in my studies, I realized that there was no explicit contradiction in the idea of an all-loving, all-powerful God and evil existing simultaneously with that. It's probably why I've learned in my going through my degree as a philosopher, not many people defend the logical problem of evil anymore. Alvin Plantinga is pretty renowned for his free will defense in the problem of evil. It's something that I'm currently working on myself. I haven't actually made up my mind fully on how I can answer that. I actually plan on writing my dissertation on it for my PhD. But in my study, going through these things, I did actually come across some pretty compelling arguments for the existence of God. One of these, such as the Kalam cosmological argument put on for William Lane Craig, which would be everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now obviously that doesn't lead you to the existence of God, but in this argument you define universe as basically all of space-time reality. So if space-time had a beginning, then what follows is that if that does indeed have a cause, then whatever the cause of the universe must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, unchanging, so on and so forth. So it doesn't necessitate that it be a God, but it does say that whatever the qualities that entity has, it must be those. Second, one of my favorite other arguments is the argument from fine-tuning, which was actually written by one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume, which Matt actually might be a little bit surprised of that. And I'm just going to read what he writes. Look round the world, contemplate the whole and every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines which admit to subdivision, to a degree beyond what human faculties can trace and explain. All of these various machines, even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since therefore the effects resemble one another, we are led to infer by the rules of analogy that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties, proportioned to the grandeur of the work which is executed. Now, though, of course, as beautiful as the argument is, and how right it seems, Hume also wrote a critique about it, and I agree with his critique. The argument doesn't imply that it's a God. It doesn't tell us which God. It could be a team of gods. It depends on what we mean by God. Well, just from the argument itself, it doesn't stand as an argument for the existence of God. What it does tell us that there is pretty good reason to think that there might be some sort of design behind it all, and I think in fact, it's probably more correct than chance or necessity. But if we take this argument, we can simply use it as another string in the web of belief that further increases the warrant for the existence of God based on other things. So one of my favorite arguments, probably my actual favorite argument, is the ontological argument. I know not many people know what that is. So ontology is basically the study of the nature of being. So St. Anselm first came up with this argument. He wanted to come up with an argument that it was one argument that you could present, one argument that was perfectly irrefutable, that was it. So he happened upon this idea of a greatest conceivable being. And he sets this argument up as a reductio ad absurdum. What he does is he has us to consider the greatest conceivable being, a being of maximum power, moral perfection, omniscience, knowledge to the maximum extent. And we can conceive of this in our mind, but given that it's the greatest conceivable being, it would be contingent upon your own mind if it existed in your own mind. Therefore, it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, and we can conceive of one that's greater, one that's not contingent upon your own mind. So he actually, given that the concept of God being the maximally great being, if that belief is actually possible, it follows by rules of modal logic, which I don't have time to explain, but I'm sure we're going to get to it in cross-examination, that it actually does exist. I'm going to quickly go through the argument, just so we have something that you actually know what we're talking about and we can go on. Basically, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, it exists in some possible world. If it exists in some possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds. This world is a possible world, therefore it exists. Now obviously that seems horribly wrong, and a lot of people misunderstand the argument, but it comes from the nature of the concept in the first principle, in the first premise, that a maximally great being is indeed possible. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about this, and I'm sure everyone is completely lost, but that's okay. So basically what I want to get at is that I studied arguments, and I came to the belief in some sort of generic God, a God of the philosophers. I didn't really do anything with it. It wasn't all that important to me, I guess. I did just want to kind of figure out if things were that it was the case, and I did actually come to belief in God. About the time that I was around 21, I got a letter from my old church that they were charging me with heresy for joining a church of not like faith and order, which was First Baptist. So yes, I'm actually officially labeled a heretic and charged and convicted. That's pretty awesome. But what that did do was cause me to start questioning a little bit more. For the first time, and I don't even know how long it had been, years, I opened my Bible because I thought I set out to try to prove the church wrong. I wanted to prove them wrong in their doctrine and their understanding of the scriptures. So, that's what I tried to do. But in going through and trying to disprove them, I simply set aside those goals. I wanted to figure out more about the character of Jesus and if he actually existed. There's pretty much a consensus among historians and scholars that there is some sort of Middle Eastern guy named Yeshua who lived in the earliest portion of the first century, had quite a number of followers who believed him to be a healer with divine authorities and did lots and lots of stuff that they couldn't really explain. I'm not going to say that they did miracles because I don't actually know what a miracle is. Typically people define miracle as an act of God, but if you define it as that way, then you don't really get anywhere. Another thing would be something that we just don't understand, something that seems impossible according to our current understanding of the natural world. But what was part of our current understanding of the natural world 300 years ago we now know that those aren't possible. So I'm not sure what a miracle is, so I don't try to use that term or give some sort of argument for miracles or anything of that nature. But what we do know is, from history, from the eyewitness accounts, they believed that Jesus was their Messiah, their Savior, the one that was prophesied from their scriptures. We have good reason to believe that Yeshua was tortured and crucified under Pontius Pilate for claiming to be the Messiah, and he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and 3 days later, Jesus' followers believed that he had risen from the dead. It doesn't necessitate that that is actually the case, but it does show that something happened in the early church, in the earliest fathers, that they believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And most of them, all of them, and I know of except for John, was actually tortured and crucified for that belief. So through many months, many books, I actually came to believe that Jesus actually existed and rose from the dead and all sorts of other things. I'm trying to hurry. I know I have like 5 seconds left. Hopefully you'll give me an extra like 30. But I didn't do anything with the belief. I believed that God existed. I believed that Jesus existed. It wasn't until I actually had a horrible, pretty rough shift. Got off a couple hours late, and I was in the shower, contemplating life as everybody else does. And I was looking at my experiences in life, and I came to the things that I was guilty of. It was the full realization of the separation of God. That was the belief that formed in me. I already believed in God. I already believed in Jesus, but it was the full recognition of my separation from God. And in that shower that morning, my belief came in part due to reason, history, and part subjective experience. All stand on their own in their own way and provide warrant in their own way, but together they raise the level of warrant to the degree of certainty that I have met my threshold of belief. Thank you.
I think my mic's working. Clearly somebody prayed more for my mic than Phillip's. I'm not making this stuff up. Can I get a letter from that same church officially declaring me a heretic? Because I don't have one of those. I love that. I'm sure they say it when I'm out there. How you doing? Yeah. I'm really happy to be back here at Austin Peay. I was here a year and a half ago or so to debate John Ferrer, as has already been mentioned. When I came here for the National Nuns Convention, which was yesterday, and I was fortunate enough to be the keynote, that was a great convention, and when they found out I was coming down, they said, hey, you want to come back and do another debate? And I was like, duh. I will debate at the drop of a hat. Just ask my wife, who has reminded me that not everything has to be debated, and I said, yes, it does. So the subject of tonight's, that was a prayer comment, I'm sure. The subject of tonight's debate is, should you believe in a God? And there was actually some discussion about the topic, because I heard on one occasion it should be, should we believe in a God, or should one believe in a God, or should you believe in a God? And the weird thing is that it does actually change. I'm not going to nitpick every single word, but I can't actually tell you what you should believe without knowing what your reason and evidence is. I can point out flaws in your reasoning. I can point out why I don't agree. I can maybe even be able to convince you that you have believed something prematurely or on insufficient warrant, but I can't tell you what you should believe most of the time. What we should believe is a different thing. That's about what we all know, what is demonstrated, what has been confirmed and accepted. What I should believe, that I can certainly tell you about. We're not going to, I don't want to nitpick on the word in or believe or God, although the specific definition of God is a little fuzzy, and so whatever God he's defending is the one that I will talk about. Who knows, maybe I believe in that one. Einstein believed in the God of Spinoza, which is sort of a vague, deistic, not even really a God thing, it's just a label that we put out there. So the big issue is, should we? What reason do we have to believe this? Now, I do a TV show, and one of the most common questions I ask is, tell me what you believe, and then why. And it's why that is the most important part. It's interesting to me to find out what people believe, but why is the key. And more importantly than why you believe, why do you think I should believe? Why is it, what has convinced you that you think should also convince me? Fundamentally, I have no use for faith. Now, I know there are a lot of different uses for the term. I tend to define faith as the excuse people give for believing in something when they don't have a good reason. Because ordinarily, if you ask somebody why you believe something and they have a good reason, they just give you the good reason. And if they don't, then they say, hey, it's a matter of faith. And if you think that's a good way to go about deciding whether or not something's real or believable, that's entirely your prerogative. I just have no use for it. I also, by the way, I was a fundamentalist Christian for more than 25 years and was studying to be a preacher. I never was a preacher. That gets confused a lot. So for those of you who are still believers, I don't think you're idiots. My IQ didn't go up when I stopped believing. I just got access to different information viewed from a different perspective, which I now think is more correct than I was, and I'm happy to talk about why. The process by which I go about trying to figure out what I should believe is there good evidence for it? And is there a sound argument that we can make based on that evidence? The arguments that come purely from reason in the abstract, like the ontological argument, I have massive problems with because they're not grounded in anything. They are, in many cases, an attempt to kind of define something into existence that we've seemed to be impressed with or seem to think we should believe. I did a debate recently and somebody tried to argue on behalf of the supernatural by telling ghost stories. Somebody woke up in the middle of the night and had an apparition in their bedroom, and this coincided with the death of the loved one who was in the apparition. And that was enough for them to convince that reality has a supernatural component and that supernatural component includes the ability for spirits of the deceased to come back and visit. And that led them to a belief that therefore there's a soul and therefore there's a God. So this vision that they had that night was enough to serve as the foundation for everything else. I can't do that. I can't do that for a number of reasons. I'm happy to acknowledge that this person had some experience, but I don't have enough information to conclude what that experience actually was. Their explanation for that experience may be correct, may not. I don't even know if they have enough information to reach the conclusion, because we know about vivid dreaming. We know about people waking up from sleep and seeing things that aren't real. We know how do you distinguish between I had a non-real hallucination and I had a visit from the other side? There are people who can tell you about their alien abduction stories. Generally, most people don't believe that this has actually happened, and yet they tell the same stories with similar features. I'm happy to believe they've had an experience. I would prefer that they would say that they have an experience that they cannot explain, but we are so uncomfortable with acknowledging that we can't explain something. It just nags at us, I don't know what that was, I don't know what that it was, that we then begin to accept explanations proposed by others, particularly if it seems to be safe. If most people around you believe that when you're standing there singing and praising and you get goosebumps and feel euphoria, that this is you being filled with the Holy Spirit, well, of course that's going to be your explanation, but I want to know if it's true. It doesn't matter to me that there are 1,000 people having a similar experience and attributing it to the same source. I want to know why they attribute it to that source. Because if the truth is they're all just attributing it to the source that they were told to attribute it to by everybody else, then we've gotten no closer to the truth. The conclusions that you reach about anything need to be justified. This is where we get into trouble, because I will say they require not a natural explanation, but a real explanation. Something that is demonstrably real. I want to believe as many true things as few false things as possible. True is that which conforms to reality. That does not exclude the supernatural, but here's the problem. We don't apparently have any access to the supernatural. It's ill-defined. We have no way to investigate it. We can't confirm that the supernatural exists or what a supernatural existence would even be. We can't confirm that it interferes or interacts or manifests in any detectable way, and yet we must be talking about such a detection, because everybody who's a believer is claiming to be a God detector in some fashion or another. God has to manifest in a detectable way, apart from just saying, I believe this for no reason. And there are very few people who will say, oh, I have absolutely no reason other than this is just what I want to believe. And I don't actually accept that either, because you don't choose what you believe in any simple sense. I choose not to believe that gravity works or whatever. You are convinced of things, and you become convinced for good reasons and bad reasons. And you know what the difference is between good reasons and bad reasons? Nothing, if you're not aware of what makes something a good reason. What does it feel like to be wrong? Don't you think you're right the entire time you're wrong until you find out you're not? Those things are the same at that point. One of the things that comes up is that we should believe this explanation until such time as a better one comes along. That's simply fallacious. Once upon a time, you could make what appeared to be a sound, reasonable argument that the sun went around the earth. It was wrong. All of the available evidence pointed to this conclusion, and I would agree that anybody at that time with access to that information was being reasonable. They weren't correct, but they were being reasonable. And if they were to say, I believe this and it's reasonable because nobody's come up with a better explanation, now they have moved away from reason, rather than pointing to the available evidence and saying this is the best explanation. Now they are saying this is all we've got. And they're wrong. Because the other thing we've got is I don't know. My mom thinks she's going to go to heaven. I don't believe that that's what's going to happen, but I believe that my mom thinks that. I believe that my mom is sincere about her beliefs, and it troubles me that her particular religious beliefs have her convinced that I am working directly for Satan, leading people to hell, and that it would be better for me to die right here where I stand than to continue talking. That makes me sad. However, my mom also believes that there's no sadness in hell, or heaven, sorry. Plenty of sadness in hell, she believes. But there's no sadness in heaven. She believes I'm going to hell. Therefore, there's no way my mom can be in heaven if there's no sadness. Because there's no way she could ever not be sad that I'm in hell. There's an internal conflict in her belief structure that sets up something that she doesn't even recognize as problematic. Should we believe something? Is there sufficient evidence for it, or are we just giving up because we can't think of anything better at the moment? There's a number of different classical arguments for the existence of God. We've heard several of them in very short form in Philip's opening. I'm sure we'll talk more about them. Prima vivo, kalam, teleological argument, ontological arguments. I'm convinced that Jesus has existed because other people are convinced that Jesus existed. We can get into the nuts and bolts in that. There was a video that hit YouTube, and I don't know how much time I have left. If somebody can tell me, that'd be great. There's a video that hit YouTube this week. 5 minutes? You guys are in for a treat. And the title of the video is, Can Math Prove God? Now, the conclusion of the video, depending on what baggage you walked in with, is that the answer is either yes or no, which is very frustrating. But the implication is that we're trying to show that this is at least possible. Now, I disagree fully. Whether math cannot demonstrate God. Any math majors in here can tell you there's no variable God. There's no, it's not a math thing. But what he did was he set up an analysis based on our existence. It was a version of the teleological argument, which is, hey, we exist and there must be some explanation for it, etc. So he drew up a little chart which showed that if there is no God, it's incredibly unlikely that we would exist. Almost everybody agrees, life is just incredibly implausible. And if there is a God, then it's at least a little more plausible because that God would have the capacity and perhaps the desire to do so. And then he argued that if there were many gods, the likelihood even goes up because now you've got many different gods to choose from about which one might have the capacity and the desire to bring us into existence. And then he went further to talk about how it's even more likely that we're in a simulation. The simulation one shouldn't have been included in the video at all. It's irrelevant to the question, and it just pushes it off further because whoever created the simulation, now you've got to address who created their simulation and who created their simulation. You've got to get back to the starting point, so I just ignored that. But here's the thing. They put up, let's say it's one, I'll just make the numbers easy. If there is no God, our existence is 1 in a million, or 1 in a billion. If there is a God, it's 1 in a million. And if there's many gods, it's 1 in 1,000. It doesn't matter what the numbers are, or does it? That's my first objection. Somebody pulled a bunch of numbers out of thin air. This is what we suppose. It seems incredibly unlikely that life would form. How do you know that? Maybe the odds of life occurring in this particular universe with these particular sets of strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, gravity, etc., maybe life is certain. Maybe life's all over the place. NASA just found a number of planets in a Goldilocks zone a ways away from us. Maybe we're not alone. I don't know. But how unlikely is it? It just seems unlikely. Well, how it seems is not relevant to how it is. But the second thing is that it seems more likely if there was a God. And I can demonstrate the problem with this argument, I hope, very clearly. If we were to flip a coin, a fair coin, the odds of it landing head side up, 50%, right? We can all see that. What if I was to say that I want to place this coin down on the ground head side up? What are the odds that it's going to be head side up based on that? Nearly 100%. I could screw up a little bit, I'm not perfect. But it's way better than 50% as to whether or not I can set a coin down head side up. And so if the argument is, this is more likely, therefore you should believe it, then every time you find a coin laying anywhere in the world, if it's head side up, you should believe that it was placed there by a thinking person who intentionally placed it head side up. That is the most plausible explanation. And I think we all realize that's actually not the case. There's more to what you find, how you find a coin than just the factors that we're considering. And perhaps there's more to whether or not we are in a reasonable position and should believe in a God than what our limited minds have assessed so far. Ancient people may have had really good justifications for different God beliefs, and they were wrong. We know because those religions died out and nobody restarted them, there was no God to restart them, or apparently not, or he didn't care. There's over 1,000 denominations of Christianity, there's thousands of religions. And for those people who believe in a God, there's the old joke that the atheist is, we're all atheists, I just go one God further, or in the case of, Hindus, I go many, many gods further. But the idea is, do you care about whether or not your beliefs are true, or you care whether or not they're comforting, whether or not they're popular? Because the truth of a proposition isn't impacted in any way, by the number of people who believe it, how strongly they believe it, how long they've believed it, how popular they are. One thing we know is that there are lots of people who actively participate in religious activities who definitely do not believe. Some of them are standing in the pulpit and they are members of the clergy project. And I think the biggest key is to get the world to the point where you are not penalized and disparaged for acknowledging that you don't have the answer. I remember in school, come up to the blackboard and answer this. And if you didn't know, that was the single most terrifying experience. And if we get nothing else out of this and we never agree on whether or not there is a God, hopefully we can agree that we need to change the way we teach people so that they are not penalized because they don't have the answer ready. Because it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's okay to say, I'm not convinced by your argument. I'm not convinced of your position. And you need to do more. The null hypothesis, without getting too technical, is the idea that these two things are not connected. It's the default position. It is what we must overcome to show a connection. There's no connection between vaccines and autism. That's the null hypothesis. You have to demonstrate that it's wrong in order to be warranted in believing that there is a connection. Similarly, there is no connection between a God and existence until such time as it's actually demonstrated, not merely inferred or assumed. Is that your Pepsi?
That is.
We're on opposite sides in the cola wars, too.
So, we're going to have, if you two are ready to jump into the next phase, Phillip and Matt are going to talk back and forth, debate this further, mano a mano here, and then we'll have time for the audience questions after this 1 hour of discussion. Okay, thank you. You guys let it rip?
Sure. So, how long are we doing this? 4 hours? Is that right?
1 hour.
1 hour. All right.
Yeah, it's not enough time. Actually, we're on the same side of the soda wars. It's just Austin P only carries Pepsi products.
It's your university that is destroying your free will.
That is exactly the case. Well, guess if you're okay, I'll start off.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I watched that debate that you had the other day. or last month,
With
February.
Lacona?
Yep. And I think I told you I actually agreed with you on quite a lot of those things. I don't argue for a supernatural because I actually agree with Matt that it's an extremely ill-defined term. So I don't try to use anything of that nature. One thing I do want to ask you about, though, is you said that sound arguments have to be based on good evidence. What do you mean by evidence? What counts as evidence for you?
Yeah, so there's a chance that I didn't phrase that properly in the first place, because we both know, and so there's two ways to evaluate an argument in this context. Validity and soundness. Validity goes to structure. Soundness goes just to whether or not the premises are true or perhaps accepted as true. If you accept that the premises are true and reject the conclusion, you are being irrational. So when it comes to what is good evidence, it depends entirely on the claim. For example, the example that Carl Sagan used, the dragon in the garage, or the invisible dragon in the garage. So if you tell me your name's Phillip, that's a fairly benign claim that's not going to alter, what I think about reality. So I'm willing to take you at your word. So there's a sort of risk assessment to it as well. If you tell me you have an invisible pet dragon in your garage, I'm going to need a bit more. And so there's no single easy answer to this, but there's a heuristic that I try to use, which I've talked about a little bit, that I think is the way we all actually think about this, which is, I heard a claim, and my brain does something, and it's not necessarily in this order, and it's not necessarily this clear. It may be that we're constantly training our intuitions based on this heuristic, but number one, do I already believe it? Okay, cool. Number two, do I believe something similar or connected that is supporting evidence? Number three, and I'll stop numbering these. The next thing is going down. If I were to accept this and find out I was wrong, what's at risk? How much is this going to impact my life? What other things do I already accept, which if I accepted this, I would then have to reject? That gets into the sort of reductio ad absurdum. If I were to accept your claim that you have an invisible pet dragon, that changes what I feel about dragons and invisible and all kinds. And I would have to potentially, if I use this method and have this evidentiary standard for this particular claim, and I am going to be intellectually honest and apply it elsewhere, would it let in things, for example, that I know to be false or I understand to be false? That, I could flap my wings and fly. This is why the transcendental meditation folks who claim they can fly, when really they're sitting around on foam mats in a cross-legged position, hopping, and then they convince themselves that this is flying. You can watch it, but if I were to believe that they can actually fly, then that fundamentally changes so many things about what I understand about reality. So as the unknown becomes explained, it has not only its own burden of proof, but it may in fact have to overcome the burden of proof so high that it has to trump what we understand about 4 or 5 other things, or 1,000 other things.
Sure, so one of the first things you brought up is how sort of argumentation works. And think of modus ponens, okay?
Okay.
So if A then B, A then B.
Yep.
How do you actually know that to be the case? Is that actually based on some sort of evidence? Is that based on experience? Do you know that a priori? Is that actually something that you know based on some sort of evidence as you've defined it so far?
You're asking how I know modus ponens is sound?
Sure.
So Aristotle and his band of merry logicians got together and went through all the possible syllogistic forms with predicate logic, subject, predicate, and where's the connection, and demonstrated which ones of those were valid in structure and which ones aren't. The way they did that was to rely on something that I think is often misnamed, which the logical absolutes. Essentially the idea of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. Those are the foundation of all reason. They're the foundation of math. If those things are not correct, that A equals A does not equal not A, and everything is either A or not A. If that's not true, then we can't have any sort of discussion. All reason falls out. So there are theists who claim that they have a sound foundation for those logical absolutes, the presuppositionalists. I don't. I presuppose that identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle are true, are absolutely true, are inviolable, and all of the evidence continues to demonstrate that, and until such time as it doesn't, I don't see any reason to change that. And the weird thing is, everybody agrees on that part, even if they disagree. Well, I'm sure that you find somebody who probably disagrees, but now you're no longer dealing with a reasonable person.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the foundation. The goal is to have as few assumptions, unwarranted assumptions, as you can. So far as I'm aware, that is my one, and I don't call it unwarranted because it continually demonstrates its reliability.
No, I completely agree. In fact, I think that those are the highest degrees of warrant. Beliefs such as those have the highest degree of warrant that we can. We know those simply by, I would say that we know them a priori, which we generally think of a priori as prior to experience. But I think there's actually a little bit of experience involved.
Yeah, I don't.
It's a little technical.
So it is somewhat a priori prior to experience, but
right.
There's a way I think that demonstrates this. The example that I've used, which seems to make clear to everybody. Imagine just a single circle, the simplest Venn diagram you could possibly draw, a single circle on that thing above me, and you label everything that's inside the circle as A, and everything outside the circle is not A. That is a perfect demonstration of the totality of all three of those, because whatever is A, whatever's in the circle is A, whatever's not in the circle is not A, and everything, because it goes way beyond the borders of this screen, it goes on forever, everything is either A or not A. And that's kind of the simplest, obvious demonstration of it I can think of.
Sure. So one thing that I tried to argue, even though I wasn't able to explain the nature of warrant or anything of that nature, was what provided warrant for my belief. And I offered a couple arguments that I truly would love to talk about and I hope you'll ask me about. But there's one argument that you presented that this is really one of the only ones that I could find. Because most of what you said, I actually tended to agree a lot. But the problem was, the only argument that I could really find that you pointed out that maybe we shouldn't believe in the existence of God was your mom's belief, no sadness in heaven, or she would be sad going
That's
forward.
not an argument against God.
Oh, okay.
Not at all.
Good.
It's
Okay,
not
well,
even
then I
an
have
argument that we
nothing more
shouldn't
to say
believe.
about
It's an argument about a specific belief that is potentially contradicting itself.
Okay.
So that wasn't even in my notes. It was just, sometimes stuff just pops in my head.
Yeah.
Like Jesus. No, and by the way, my goal is never to offend anybody here. I'm not overly concerned because I know people are going to be offended no matter what. But it's not the goal. That's why we're having this sort of conversation. So my whole position on why we shouldn't believe in God is really simple. Because it has not met its burden of proof.
Okay.
But if I spent 15 minutes saying that, they would have fallen asleep.
Yeah, I think you actually woke them up from mine.
Yeah. So, and I don't know how we're going to do this, but
Yeah.
there's one thing that you just said a minute ago that I'm a little confused by. That you're not necessarily arguing for a supernatural God, and yet...
Well, I don't know what supernatural means.
I don't either.
Okay.
So we're in agreement we don't have a good definition or understanding, between the two of us at least, of what supernatural is.
Correct.
But
Well, I'm not so sure we have a good definition of natural either.
Well, we don't have a complete understanding of what is natural,
Sure.
but as we explore the world, we continually add, this is natural. So there is this idea, which I think we perhaps agree on, which is things that are currently labeled as supernatural. I don't know what the justification is for that, other than it being a bucket where you just put things you can't explain. But every time we found an explanation for something that had previously been attributed to supernatural, it's always been a natural explanation because we have no mechanism to confirm supernatural. So if God is not supernatural, wouldn't that mean that nature itself, which when I talk about nature, there's the reason I distinguish between real and natural, because the real would include both if in fact they exist.
I like that distinction.
Okay. All I'm able to investigate is the natural world. And in investigating the natural world, I find no evidence for God. And the bulk of religious ideas about God, even the God of simple classical theism, they make it appeal to be not bound by nature. Is the God that you're arguing for, is it bound by nature, not bound by nature, or not currently understood to be bound by nature?
I would say actually not currently understood to be bound by nature.
So we don't know enough about it to categorize it.
So I think we know enough to be able to explain it. So such as you take like G.E. Moore when he talks about his moral philosophy, we can't actually define good or what a game is or something of those things, but we can talk about them to a pretty high level without a complete, full, 100% understanding of what it is.
We can come up with a definition to agree that that is what we are discussing. So I'm just looking for...
Well, I mean, you can't do that with good or anything according to G.E. Moore.
You couldn't do that with good? You and I couldn't say this is what we mean by good when we're having this discussion?
Sure, but then we run into lots and lots and lots of problems. Because then we can find things that are good that don't fit our definition. It's pretty easy to do that with different thought experiments.
And see, I don't have a problem with that. If you and I agree, this is what we're discussing, and this is the boundaries of what we're discussing, then things that are outside the boundaries, whether or not somebody else would classify them as good, is irrelevant.
Sure. So, okay, so for example, I think that we can know some attributes of God. We may not be able to know all of them. We can't know why.
Which ones and how?
Sure. So one of the arguments I found convincing was the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And as I said, I know that this doesn't get us to a definition of, or it doesn't give us to God, but it does tell us what sorts of properties that the entity that created the universe must have, if the premises are true, of course.
So the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't even include the word God.
No, it doesn't. That's why I said it doesn't have a conclusion that leads to God.
And the conclusion is that the universe has a cause for its existence. That is the conclusion. And yet you list that as one of the things that convinces you that there is a God.
Not necessarily. I think that it can add as a string to my web of belief. So what I've gotten is that it gives us some sorts of properties that are necessary for that sort of entity that could be the cause of the universe.
How did you determine that it's an entity?
I don't know if there's another term for it. So this is why I wish I had time to explain the modal ontological argument. Care if I do that really quick?
Go ahead.
Okay. So
although we're jumping from cosmological to modal ontological.
I know, I'm coming back to it. It's simply the same thing. I know, I'm sorry.
I'll put an asterisk.
Yes, please do. Push me on it, I promise. I won't, I'm not trying to escape it. So when we talk about the modality, I'm basically getting at the nature of entities. Within this argument, entities are defined in one of three ways: necessary, contingent, or impossible. So a modality deals with the nature of necessity, nature being what it takes for how something exists, essentially. So necessary entities, I'm just going to give examples of each one. So impossible entities, married bachelors, things of that nature. Contingent entities, you could say like a unicorn. It's possible that a unicorn exists in some possible world, but it doesn't exist in all possible worlds. Necessary entities exist in all possible worlds, cannot fail to exist in any possible world. So necessary entities would be, so I'm a Platonist, so I'm going to say that numbers, absolute truth, shape definitions, laws of logic, laws of absolutes, those things exist necessarily. They exist in all possible worlds. In and of themselves, they cannot fail to exist, and they don't have their existence reliant on any other thing. So in this sort of argument with, maximally great being, I sort of rushed through it. Belief in God as a maximally great being, going through that argument and actually explaining it a little bit, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. So purely thinking about what it is to be a maximally great being, if you look at it in the same way that you're looking at a logical absolute, or that 2 + 2 = 4, this is simply a belief that automatically forms by pure light of reason. It's not something that you deliberate evidence, it's just there. Well, purely thinking of the concept of a maximally great being, if that belief if it is actually possible, which I think it is, it follows just in the way of a mathematical proof that actually does exist. So if somebody tells me, can you imagine a world without God? Honestly, because I accept the nature of the ontological argument, I really have a hard time, because I can't imagine a world in which 2 + 2 does not equal 4. I can't imagine a world in which the logical absolutes, it's not how our minds work.
So All right, we'll put a pin and get back to the cosmological argument while we deal with this ontological argument.
But that's what I mean by entities. Entities are just
Sure. The
things
problem is
that fit
this.
entities.
I don't accept that the thought just immediately presents itself as if it were sound, that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. I need to know, first of all, how on earth could we possibly be justified in concluding that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist? Additionally, one of the major problems that I have with ontological arguments, well, it doesn't, modal logic's fine, is that the formulation is such that it really only applies to this one thing. That there's something specific and unique about maximally great, that we're folding in that existence is better than non-existence, that possibility is there, and that maximal greatness would include the existence in all possible worlds. But at the very beginning, when you say, it is possible for a maximally great being to exist, how can we know that?
Well, so you put it through your same sort of proof that you would any sort of mathematical proof. It's simply by light of reason. I believe, so it might be good to talk about the nature of belief a little bit and how it arises. So I said that some things just come simply by light of reason. Those are the things that we can be absolutely certain about, such as 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, first of all, I don't think we can be absolutely certain about anything.
Including non-existence or 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, I don't see
Okay, maybe I can just change the...
But 2 + 2 = 4 is something we can demonstrate. It is possible for a maximally great being to exist. It's not. I want to know how you demonstrate that, because if you're going to put that on the same level as 2 + 2 = 4 and just claim that they are intuitive and perhaps properly basic, I want to know what the justification for that is, because I can show and teach somebody 2 + 2 = 4, the how and why behind it. Here. We can't do anything like that with the idea that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist, as far as I'm aware.
Sure, except there's something really interesting about that, because you actually make a ton of assumptions whenever you talk about perceptual beliefs and when we add 2 and 2 together, because that increases the level of warrant or provides additional avenues to which we know that 2 + 2 = 4. So we think that objects, whenever we place them together and we don't change their relationship or we change their identity, when you add 2 and 2 together, they make 4. And we have good, reliable,
in base
every
10.
time we do it, yes, in base 10. But no matter what base you're in, 2 and 2 still make 4. It's just you're changing the words of what each one means.
So now you're talking about something different than...
Well, you brought it up, so I addressed
I
question about it.
I just don't want to lose everybody
Right.
down the
But what I'm
40
saying is
rabbit
that-
holes we're going to hit here in the next 5 minutes.
I know, I chase rabbits a lot. I don't look like it, though, I know, sorry.
I have a rabbit joke for you later, but it's inappropriate for this thing. Sorry.
But you can take certain things and you can make 4 and 4, but just because you take 2 things and 2 things together, it doesn't mean that it's always actually going to make 4. You can't make that as some sort of necessary object. That's something that we know by experience. But we know that abstractly from understandings of 2 and 2 and addition
I
and
get
equals
that we
2,
understand
that
it from
equals 4.
abstractions, and I get that we
So
understand
the
it from
experience
things.
just verifies it a little bit more.
There's a way to demonstrate this.
Sure, but you don't need that. That's what I'm saying. Just simply by light of reason, you can know that 2 + 2 = 4. Just by understanding the concepts themselves, it simply is the case.
Yes, but do we understand the God concept, and what do we mean by possible in order to intuit that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist?
Sure.
Because while I can envision, well, actually, I would argue that perhaps you cannot actually imagine a maximally great being, because you would require maximally great understanding to even know what that means. All you can do is kind of hyperbolize with the concepts of saying, I can imagine somebody running really fast, I can imagine somebody running faster, I can imagine somebody running the fastest possible, but I have no idea what the fastest possible is, so I'm not really imagining it. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about how do we know that a maximally great being is possible anywhere?
Sure. So, possibility, in this sense, we're talking about logical possibility. This is the whole nature of possible worlds, where we determine whether something is contradictory or not, something of that nature. So it is proposed, as Anselm did, He proposed that there is some sort of necessary entity that he didn't use. He actually used maximally great being or greatest conceivable being. He proposed it. So I tie maximal greatness in typically power, knowledge to their maximum extents. Some people tie in moral perfection. I think it's a little bit harder. But if you tie something such as power into the concept of self that you're proposing, if the entity were to fail in some possible world, it's one possible world in which it wouldn't be maximally great. So just purely understanding the concept itself, it follows from the rules of modal logic, premises 2 through 5 of axiom S5.
I only care about premise 1.
Right, and that's the important part of the argument.
I agree.
If it is actually possible, modal logic dictates that it actually exists in this world, given that this world is a possible world.
If it's possible, how do we
Yes.
determine that it is possible?
There is nothing contradictory in the proposition that has been proposed.
So you're saying it's possible because you can't demonstrate that it's not possible?
No, I'm saying that it's possible because I've given a couple of the attributes that it would require. In fact, you can add some of those from the Kalam cosmological, say spaceless, timeless, immaterial, so on and so forth. None of these seem
so those aren't from the Kalam, but we'll get back to that.
Well, it is in the way that the universe is defined, space-time reality. If it had a beginning, space and time had a beginning.
I'll disagree,
Okay.
but the big thing is, if it's possible for a maximally great being to exist,
Sure.
is the first premise.
Mhm.
I see no demonstration that it is in fact possible. In order for it to be a reasonable argument, you'd have to have some way of demonstrating that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, because I see no demonstration that it's not actually impossible, that maximal greatness is a sort of hyperbolic construct that we can envision or imagine, but yet is not actually possible in reality.
So I think that just comes from a misunderstanding of modal logic. So
Modal
This is
logic
the
is
thing.
utterly irrelevant to the single premise.
actually, modal logic deals with the nature of necessity, and we're proposing a necessary entity. So if it is possible, which I know you keep asking me why I think it's possible, I've proposed this entity that is maximally great, meaning that it has power and knowledge to their maximum extent. It has existence to the maximum extent in that it is necessary, and it exists in all possible worlds. Is there a contradiction in the proposition?
So any proposition that doesn't have a contradiction, we should just accept?
Not necessarily,
That's the point.
but
I'm
no,
looking for
it's not just the
If you're going to
point.
describe a necessary being, and you're going to say if a maximal being is possible, all I want to know is, how do we demonstrate that a maximal being is possible? How can we be confident that it is not in fact impossible for something maximally great to exist?
So I think it's going to be helpful for everybody if maybe I go through the argument with something that's not necessary to show sort of how it works, how modal logic works. So let's propose it is possible that a unicorn exists. Okay?
I don't know if it's possible that
Sure, so we have to define what a unicorn is.
Yep.
And from that, if it is a physical being and there's possible worlds in which there are no physical objects, then that's one possible world in which it doesn't exist. So you stop at premise 2. It doesn't go on to premise 3 to say that if it exists in some possible world, then it exists in all possible worlds.
Yeah, if the first premise isn't something you can actually confirm, the rest of it doesn't matter, so you stop there.
Right, and that's
Which is why I'm
how
stopping after the
modality
first premise.
and language
That's
works.
why I'm stopping after the first premise. I see no reason to believe that the first premise is true.
So you're essentially rejecting how modal logic works and how
No,
we propose
I'm
propositions.
rejecting a premise. I'm not rejecting modal logic. I'm rejecting a premise. The premise is it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. That is not a premise that I accept, nor have I been given any reason to accept. And instead, we keep trying to go on to premise 2 and premise 3 and talk about modal logic. I'm trying to find out how, and you want to equate it with 2 plus 2 equals 4. How can I be confident that it is in fact possible for a maximally great being to exist?
So I said that we propose the entity in the first premise.
That's all I'm talking about, is the first premise.
Yes. So I've proposed the entity. I've already said. One that has power and knowledge to the maximum extent.
So proposing it is how we can be confident that it is in fact possible.
No, it's how we gauge the logical possibility and how it works in terms of impossibility, necessity, and contingency.
If I were to ask you, how can we be confident that it's possible to mix the water and the Pepsi together? There's ways to demonstrate that.
Sure.
And yet when I ask, how can we be confident that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, I get nothing that even comes close to that.
Well, I talked about how we have an understanding of 2 plus 2.
Yeah. I got no problem with 2 plus 2.
Sure. But you believe that not based on the fact that you can demonstrate it.
Yes,
you
I do.
have, so that increases.
That is one aspect of it.
That is one aspect.
The real issue is, do I believe it because of that, and what you're talking about is abstract notions reinforces it, or do I believe it because the abstract notion in this? But on either case, we have two things. We have this abstract concept, this hypothesis, this proposition, and then we have demonstrations of it. And when you're talking about it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, I see no demonstration. I'm not even convinced that the abstract concept that we're talking about is something that someone could actually hold.
Can you demonstrate a logical absolute? Or do you know it by something other than demonstration?
I already acknowledge those are the presuppositions, and the best demonstration I can come up with is this in order to express the concept.
Sure, but that comes from an understanding of identity. That comes from understanding of what A is. So you're proposing this in some sort of way, correct?
Okay,
but we're not demonstrating.
I just did. I demonstrated it.
Okay, go again, because lost me.
With the Venn diagram. I'm demonstrating what I'm proposing. I'm demonstrating the substance of what I'm talking about. A single Venn diagram with a single circle demonstrates the logical absolutes.
Okay.
It does not confirm that they are in fact absolute, but it demonstrates that they are correct, and then the use of them continually reproves and demonstrates their reliability. And in fact, you would have to assume that they were true in order to try to demonstrate that they were not true, which leads to a contradiction, which is only a problem if you accept them in the first place. And God, I just lost everybody. None of that is remotely like, I have proposed that it's possible for a maximally great being to exist. Cool, I understand the proposition. I don't care about what follows after it until we demonstrate that I have good reason to accept your proposition.
I'm going to suggest we soon go back to the cause argument.
Sure, we can go back to cosmology.
Are you okay, Phillip?
Yeah, sure, we can go back to the
Okay.
cause argument. That's fine.
So the cosmological argument ends with, therefore the universe has a cause.
Yeah.
At no point does it mention God.
Nope.
At no point does it say anything about the characteristics of the cause.
Sure.
It doesn't in any way include the idea that the cause must be an agent, that it must be thinking. It doesn't include that it must be spaceless, timeless, or any of the things that are applied to it. But if we were to infer after the argument that if we take a further assumption that the cause of the universe could not remotely be contained in and of itself and therefore must be external to that, that gets people to, therefore the cause is spaceless, timeless, eternal, blah, blah, blah. Right?
Okay. So I would slightly disagree just in the nature of premise 2 because of how the universe is defined. The universe is defined as space-time reality.
That's not a premise in Kalam. Premise 2 is the universe began to exist, or it's actually...
Right, but we have to know what's in the premise. I'm saying that we've defined the universe as space-time reality in premise 2.
Okay.
Correct?
If you want to call the universe space-time, fine.
Sure. So there's good evidence, both scientific and through reason, that space and time had a beginning. Right?
Okay.
Okay, so from that, given that it must have a cause, according to the argument, whatever the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial. Okay, spaceless and timeless, and we can stop there.
Whatever the cause is, we're inferring that the cause is not the universe itself.
Yes.
Okay. That tells me nothing about what it is. It tells me what it's not.
Sure.
So, if we have the cause of the universe is not the universe, I don't see any, what I see happening, and I don't see you doing this, but is this idea that therefore the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, immensely powerful, all of these sorts of things which we have not demonstrated. And then what happens then is they say, gosh, that sounds an awful lot like God, except that the only reason we have that concept of God is because men throughout history have proposed the idea that there is a God and given him that properties. We have no access to a God that I'm aware of to determine that those properties actually exist, or that the cause, for example, let's say the cause was a thinking, immensely powerful agent. and it created the universe and ceased to exist, that it just spewed forth its entire essence to become the universe.
Okay.
In that case, whatever that was, if we call it a God, it no longer exists. And so if we were to believe that a God exists, and
I would ask you to define that God,
ask me to,
because it's not my understanding of God.
we're not talking about your understanding of God at this moment. I'm saying,
Or the God that I've proposed, which is the one that you said you talk about here tonight.
so this is a reductio.
Sure.
Okay. So in that scenario, there's nothing to lead us to conclude that God still exists, right?
Sure, I wouldn't call it a God if it ceases to exist, because then it's not necessary. I wouldn't call it a God if it ceases to exist or began to exist, because then it would not be a necessary entity.
Okay, so
So it's not a God, which I agree with you. The argument doesn't lead us to some sort of necessary entity. The cause of this universe very well could be a gazorp. I don't know, but I'm agreeing.
if
I'm
that's
not.
the case, and the Kalam cosmological argument is part of this, you
Sure.
just acknowledge that the cause of this universe could be a glorp, you don't know what it is and everything else. How does the Kalam cosmological argument get you to a God, if that's the case?
Right. So I said that the argument can stand just as the argument from fine-tuning as a string in the web of belief.
Well, sure, if you already accept that there's a necessary God, and you look at the universe and say, wow, it needs to have a cause, the necessary God fills that, of course you're going to be convinced, but I care whether or not it's true, not whether or not you're convinced.
Sure. So from the ontological argument, that's where I get this idea that God is a necessary entity. So if I hold the ontological argument to be correct, then I can make some sorts of assumptions, and I can use that as one of my strings in the web of belief, to which I can include the Kalam, fine-tuning, my own personal subjective experience, so on and so forth. And that all just adds more and more and more strings,
So
and they have to be coherent.
are any of those points in the various strings, are any of them absolute certainties?
No.
Okay. So
But you don't have to be absolutely certain to have knowledge.
I agree. I don't think you can be absolute and certain about anything.
I think you can be absolutely certain about some things, and it's very, very few.
Sure. That's not, so basically you have a whole bunch of strings that you are using, something from the ontological, something from cosmological. You're absolutely certain about none of them.
Yes,
What?
that's correct.
Sure.
I'm actually,
So the plural of anecdote is not data. And when we begin to multiply, hang on, no. And when we begin to multiply uncertainties, we can never be more certain in the conclusion, not only than whatever our strongest one is, but as soon as we start multiplying, it necessarily becomes less confident.
so I didn't say that I wasn't absolutely certain about some of them. I said those particular arguments I was not absolutely certain of.
Are we absolutely certain in anything that leads us to a God? Or are you, I suppose, absolutely certain in anything that ties to this God? But even if you're absolutely certain about this one, you're still multiplying by uncertainties. So you're still diminishing your confidence with every single...
Actually, no, I'm adding to coherence. That's how coherence theory works.
Okay.
Okay.
I-
I'm not sure what the problem is there. Let's...
If I'm absolutely confident about this, and I'm going to use it, I'm absolutely confident this pen exists,
Sure.
and I'm going to use this as one thread in an argument for something else I'm convinced of.
Oh, I see the problem.
And
Okay, so...
everything that I add that has less confidence actually diminishes. We move further away from absolute confidence as we add more to it. We may be building a case for something of reasonableness. You can use,
Sure.
Bayesian analysis to try to determine what the probability of something is. But in your case, you begin with an ontological argument. You think that God is necessary, and you see no problem with the first premise that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. I remain wholly unconvinced of that. And then when we get back to the cosmological argument, it has nothing to do with God other than, hey, the universe has to have a cause. Which, by the way, I have potential problems with that as well. But if you're going to say that the best explanation for the origin of the universe is this necessary God, and you're convinced that there...
Let's say that.
Okay. See, and this is what confused me. You didn't say that. Then how is the cosmological argument remotely relevant if you don't actually think that the best explanation for the origin of the universe is God?
So I do, but it's based on other arguments as well. So this is where you said that we start from this belief that we're absolutely certain of, and then anytime that you add additionally, you reduce its certainty. I'm not sure that that actually is the case or how that actually works,
It's
but
multiplying, but yeah.
I realized the problem was I didn't really define how I think that sort of thing works. So I'm actually a foundationalist. I'm no longer...
So we're close, because I'm a foundationalist, but...
Right. So I actually wrote a pretty large paper evaluating Susan Hack's
I
belief.
thought you were reaching in your pocket to pull the paper out, and I was like, okay.
No.
Susan Hawk's not here, but I'm sure we could have a good conversation with her.
Sure, no. So I wrote a rather large paper on foundationalism. I think her view actually collapses into foundationalism because she accepts these certain givens within the crossword puzzle, her crossword puzzle analogy. Also, her critique against foundationalism is simply flawed. What it is, maybe I should explain foundationalism a little bit, maybe regress problem. Is that okay? Does it matter?
I really want to, so does it make any difference? So the question here is, should we believe in a God? And your answer seems to be yes, based on primarily the idea that God is a necessary being as you think is demonstrated by the ontological argument. And my answer is no, because I don't see sufficient evidence to warrant belief. And when I talk about, I mean, I don't want to keep hammering on the first premise of the ontological argument, but at the end of the day, I need something more than we've asserted this, we can think of it, we don't have a way to show it's not possible, therefore we're going to claim that it's necessary.
So that's not how that works. I'm really not seeing where the disconnect is. When you propose an entity within modal logic, you assess its logical possibility. If the entity turns out to be necessary, as in the way that you've defined it, the way that its properties interact, you assess the logical possibility. If it is indeed possible, according to our knowledge skill set, then it does in fact follow, if it is necessary, that it does exist in the actual world. If you want to accept logic and how it works.
When you say logical possibility,
Yes.
isn't it true, because I had this back and forth with Blake about this, logical possibility essentially is that something is possible until it's demonstrated to be impossible. An empirical possibility is that possibility needs to be demonstrated.
Okay.
Okay? So you are arguing for the logical possibility.
Oh, so we're basically rationalists versus empiricists.
And
at this
I
point.
am talking about the empirical possibility.
Sure. So I am most certainly a rationalist. I'm definitely not an empiricist in this case.
So just as somebody who doesn't have a philosophy degree like most of the people out here, why don't we stop with the labels and talk about what we mean?
Okay.
Because I'm with you, but I feel like, and I don't want to pull the audience, but I'm pretty sure there would be heads nodding saying, I get what you guys are talking about, but then you throw out a word, and if we sit here and keep defining, we're going to teach an entire lecture up here. You want to help us out and start giving the definition? I want to know why I should believe in a God. Because I have yet to find any compelling reason. And yet, the world is full of people who believe in all sorts of gods, and they absolutely disagree on every aspect of this God's character, and in some cases, whether or not it's necessary that a God exists. And given that, it would seem to me, does the God that you're arguing for, maybe this will be useful, does the God that you believe in, does he interact with reality in detectable ways?
Yeah, through the nature and character of Jesus.
Through what?
Jesus. So, Christianity, of course, I'm a Christian.
But Jesus isn't here.
No, but we take the historical method just like with Jesus, just like we do any other.
Okay. I'm looking for what detectable manifestations of a God exist right now that we can see. Verify. I don't mean see like with your eyes. I mean understand.
Right. So, I would say we're going to go back to, nature of ontology, what God is. And this is because it's through rationality, through logic, thinking about what God is.
I don't know what God is. And
Sure,
I'm asking you about your God. And if all you can do is tell me that your God necessarily exists, that's not a debate. That's an assertion.
You're right.
Okay.
But, as I've talked about, it was probably a really bad choice to use modality in a debate such as this. It really was. So,
Well, so you think God manifests through Jesus? I get that, and we could possibly talk about that. I'm happy to. But the thing is, Jesus isn't here right now.
sure.
So what manifestations do we have now? How does God manifest in reality now?
Other than being able to deduce it as a creator, sustainer, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know if
how
we
did
can
we-
verify prayer. I don't know if supernatural exists or anything of that nature.
Sure.
So I'm probably not the best person to argue from that way.
So how do we know that God manifested once upon a time in Jesus?
Basically just through history.
Okay. So the thing about history, I would say, I know that we're perhaps not defined miracle.
Yeah.
And whether this manifestation of God in Jesus is real, is supernatural or natural, we'll just set that aside. What is it about this where you can say God manifests himself in Jesus in a way that we can verify through stories of oral traditions passed on where we don't have access to the individuals who said things, when we know that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable? How can I be confident that God manifested in Jesus, and why is your reason for that fundamentally different from the Muslim who's convinced that God manifested through Muhammad?
Sure. So it was actually in my study of Christianity and Islam that me rejecting Islam came down to the beliefs about Jesus. So Islam teaches that Jesus was not crucified, that there was an impostor put up, and then he went on to continue teaching for another 40 years. But the evidence that we have doesn't align with that particular view. So you say that it's copies of stories, but that doesn't actually take away any sort of reliability. Take, for example, if I have my opening statement, which I wrote down bits and pieces of, if I have this entire document and I give it to every single person in this room, and you all have to write it out as well, every single person is probably going to, well, actually it's pretty short, so maybe you all won't make a mistake, but if I had a sufficiently long document, most everyone is going to make a mistake. They're going to make a mistake at a certain place. It's pretty unlikely that any two people are going to make the same mistake. It's possible, but pretty unlikely. So if everyone in this room copies this document to the best of their ability, and some person decides that they don't like one thing that I say, well, they can change it, but then it disagrees with every other document that everyone else wrote. So yes, there's going to be variations. Yes, there's going to be some sort of differences within the document, and some people may have even changed something, but when you weigh that against the context of everything else and all the other manuscripts and documents that everyone else has written, you can still produce my original work.
So I'll concede that for the sake of making this point.
Sure.
I want to know if your original work is true. Not whether or not I have a reliable copy of your original work, but whether or not your original work was true.
Sure. So
The fact that I have a bunch of reliable copies of your original work doesn't tell me anything about whether it was true.
right, but I brought that up because you said something about copies, and most people,
Sure,
whenever they initially think of that, they say
Well,
that, oh, it's unreliable because
It
of
is
that.
unreliable. You can't reconcile the gospel accounts. They're all over the place in details. The
And you
thing
see,
is-
that's actually the nature of eyewitness accounts, though.
I agree.
As an EMT, I had to take eyewitness accounts of different events, and every single person focuses on a different aspect of something that they experience. We all experience the world in a slightly different way. So there are going to be some sorts of contradictions between the two. Some people may have focused on
And you judge reliability and you weave those together to get the best account of what probably happened that you can.
I think so.
But that doesn't tell me whether or not this actually occurred. And the question was about how can we be confident that God manifested in Jesus, and how is this fundamentally different from God manifesting in Muhammad?
Sure, so the eyewitness accounts,
What eyewitness accounts? I'm aware of no eyewitness accounts.
you wouldn't consider Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, actually,
Matthew,
Acts,
Mark,
Luke,
Luke,
no.
and John. First of all, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have no idea who wrote them.
You're absolutely right.
We have no good reason to think that they were eyewitnesses. They were written decades at least after the events. So you don't get to call them
Actual evidence doesn't suggest that, but okay.
Okay,
that's
but
fine.
you don't get to call them eyewitnesses. You have to demonstrate that they're eyewitnesses. And even if they were eyewitnesses, eyewitness testimony is still notoriously unreliable. But I only made that point because in much the same way that you suggest that when we bring up these problems, we're trying to make it seem unreliable, apologists on many occasions will say eyewitnesses when they can make no demonstration that there was an eyewitness to any of this that we have a recording of.
Phil, you say why it is reliable testimony?
So I don't just take on the outset that eyewitness accounts are just generally unreliable, because that was part of my job. That's how police find people. Those are very, very important things.
I'm not dismissing them.
Okay.
I'm not dismissing them. I'm saying we know eyewitness testimony is unreliable. We know that it's sometimes reliable.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is when you claim that they are eyewitness testimonies, you can't demonstrate that.
Right, but can anyone demonstrate that a document is an eyewitness account of anything? We couldn't do history if that was the case.
Oh no, we can still do history. It's just that we don't make assumptions. We don't say, hey, this is an eyewitness account. What we say is, this is an account. It may be an eyewitness account. It may be a report from another eyewitness account. Let's see if we can figure out how reasonable this is.
Oh, so this is why actually Luke is my favorite, what we call gospel. At the beginning, Luke is a historian. Luke gathers, so what he says is that I have gathered the eyewitness testimonies, I have done this, I have done that, so that you may know the truth of what you have been taught, most excellent Theophilus.
Okay.
So he's actually giving an account.
I came here so that you would know the truth, that there's no good reason to believe in God. Okay. I can say whatever, doesn't make it true.
No, it doesn't. And I agree.
If you
but
attest to this.
We're talking about people who we have within the account of Luke. We have real places which are verified, also in the scriptures, which you can take them as historical documents. You don't have to take them as inspired scriptures or anything of that nature. They talk about real places, real people, most likely. Sure. It seems to be the case. Am I absolutely certain? No. But given that archaeology seems to verify the people and the places, as we find other extra-biblical sources that talk about some of the people and some of the places within the first century, it adds to the confidence that those are reliable eyewitness accounts.
In 2,000 years, when they dig up New York, does that add confidence to Spider-Man?
So if you find evidence of Spider-Man, yeah, it does.
I would agree. So where's the evidence of Jesus?
So there's most certainly. Right. But see, there's a reason that the idea that there was this dude named Yeshua who claimed to be God and had tons and tons of followers actually existed. This is pretty much unanimous among historians now. There are a few, I would call them crackpots out there who don't think so.
Sure.
But the scholars, the people who specialize in that sort of thing, all do agree. So it's not necessarily an appeal to an improper authority.
I'm not arguing. There are mythicists. I even have mythicist friends, and they come in a couple different varieties. I would agree. I would call some of them crackpots. I would call others reasonable people who are objecting to assumptions that are made in history, and all they're doing is saying, hey, you can't necessarily reasonably demonstrate this. But my point is this. I can sit here and concede Jesus existed.
Yes.
Just for the sake of argument, and I'm fine with that. Jesus existed. And I can concede that he was killed, and I can concede that there was an empty tomb, and I can concede that we have a somewhat reasonably accurate record of what he said, and perhaps something close to something. And I can concede all of that, and at no point is there been any demonstration that this is a manifestation of God, or that I have a confidence level in the theological doctrines within this story with which to bet my eternal life.
Sure. So, talking about, I think that the historical evidence of Jesus, the veracity of the eyewitness accounts, I know you hate that term, but I'm just going to keep using it because you know what I'm talking about.
Okay. Could you say
this
Gospels?
Stands, oh yeah, I could, couldn't I? This stands, I think, as one of those other strings in a web of belief for me. Okay? So, those sorts of things is what ended up leading me to believe that Jesus did in fact exist, and that he was who he said he was, that he had some sort of divine authority. And no, I don't know how to define that exactly. It's something I'm still working on.
Okay.
But those people saw something in Jesus and saw Jesus do things that they were unable to explain. I'm not saying that that makes them the case that he could have performed magic. You're a magician.
I could do things nobody here can explain.
Yeah.
They're just tricks. I don't have any special powers.
Sure. But it turns out, we can take the evidence of the empty tomb, him claiming that he's going to rise from the dead and things of that nature, and we can look at the people themselves who actually believed it, went to their deaths for that belief. They didn't.
But
that
going to
met
your
my-
death for a belief doesn't
Sure.
tell me whether or not the belief's true. The 9/11
No, it
people
doesn't.
flew into buildings based in part, at least in part, on their beliefs. Doesn't tell me their beliefs are true. People have died for things, and you don't have to assume that everybody was lying.
Right.
They could all have been sincere and sincerely wrong.
Yes.
Okay. History can't confirm the supernatural. We both agree that we're not even completely sure how you could identify that error.
We're good. Yep.
And yet, if we have a report of something that, if it were accurate, would be fairly considered by most people to be supernatural. So, for example, to pull up from the Lacona debate, Mike talked about if somebody cut off his head, he was laying there dead, walks back into a room, and he asked me, would I then believe in the supernatural? And my answer was no.
And I agree.
I would believe that you were dead and that you're not dead, and I don't have an explanation. I don't get to appeal to the supernatural as an
Sure,
explanation.
and all I'm saying is that's the exact same thing that happened with the early eyewitnesses.
Yeah, except that there's a difference. If I read a book that said, we heard about this dude who had his head chopped off and then came back to life, I would not believe that.
Except that's what's so interesting about the eyewitness accounts. You say they were written decades after, but that's simply not the case and not what scholars believe any longer. There is good reason to believe that Luke Acts was written within the first decade after Jesus' life. There are still people alive. You can go through and say it's not just random writings. These people are still eyewitnesses that you can go and actually talk. That they're recordings of
So
that.
I disagree with your dates, and I think
Okay.
they are not in line with good scholarship, with Paul being the first author and the Gospels being written after that.
I
don't
didn't say
care if
Paul
they
was
were
the
written
first author.
I
Luke
don't-
Acts was written by the same person, and it wasn't Paul. I do know that.
But my point is, I don't care if they were written the same day.
Sure.
The question is, do I have good reason? You get your head cut off, you come back to life. Right now, somebody in this room writes it down. We all saw it. We can believe that you were dead and that you came back from the dead, even if we don't have an explanation. If we pass that paper around for 2,000 years to everybody else, 2,000 years from now, anybody who says they can be rationally justified in believing that event occurred, even if it did, based on that paper and several other papers, is being irrational.
But here's the difference. We have those, so maybe you disagree with the dates, that's fine. Those eyewitness accounts, you would be able, so a person such as Luke, it's not just that you have this paper and that you go and you just believe just solely based on the piece of paper. Luke, that type of person, went and actually asked the eyewitnesses who were there. He was able to verify
How do you know
what
that? How do you know
they
that?
thought they saw.
How do you know that?
Well, maybe it's just some sort of trust in the author, a trust in eyewitness accounts
Okay.
that sort of have some sort of corroboration,
Yeah,
coherent.
when there's 10 accounts of me or you rising from the dead that survived for thousands of years, and they write down that, hey, I was there with 75 other people, and I taught, and then somebody else says, I wasn't there, but I talked to one of the 75 people. My contention is that in 2,000 years, that would not be sufficient evidence to justify believing that you actually rose from the dead, even if in fact you did.
Sure.
Well, so then how can we then say that this case is sufficient evidence?
So, as I said, it's multiple aspects of the eyewitness accounts. How they work together, how the historical method works, and how we use history in every other case. We seem to come to certain conclusions about that particular thing, whether it actually happened or not. Okay? I met my threshold of belief based on authenticity of the eyewitness accounts.
So you're willing to
So it is a thread, one string within my web of belief that is on a certain foundation.
Okay.
So I have some sorts of arguments that go to my belief. I have some sorts of history that go to my belief, and then I have some sorts of subjective experiences that go to that belief. And all of those work in some sort of odd web of belief based on certain foundations, such as the logical absolutes, that I have come to my belief in God.
You guys haven't said anything about design. You don't talk about the design portion of the...
Didn't I critique my own argument on design?
Okay, go ahead.
But I can. I mean, we can talk about design if you'd like. I don't think that it actually gets us to a God. I think it's just one thing that says that our universe appears to be designed. We can't really get much further than that. But it does stand that does seem to be a case.
Sure.
It's something worth exploring. It's something I'm still exploring.
It does, so we're in agreement that the design argument doesn't get you necessarily to a God.
Correct.
So it doesn't
In fact, I don't think none of the arguments, except for the ontological, get you necessarily to a God.
Sure. So why should we believe in a God? And yours is essentially ontological, and some things that may or may not or probably don't get you to God. My issue with the idea that the universe appears designed is that we are the ones who are arrogantly assuming that it must have been designed for us to begin with.
Well, I'm not saying it's designed for us. I'm just saying that it has appearances of design. Basically, that's what we infer.
Everything that we identify as something that has an appearance of design is, of course, biased by us.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Douglas Adams has a great story about a puddle of water gaining sentience one day and looking around and, oh, isn't the world wonderfully suited for me? And this hole that I'm in was custom molded to me, and there's more to it. But of course, the truth is that water fits the container. And so there's a couple of possibilities, and one is that the universe was designed specifically with us as an intent, which I know you're not saying. And the other is that we evolved to fit the universe that we're in. And the bulk of the evidence seems to suggest the latter, and there doesn't seem to be evidence to suggest the former. But I don't think either one of us are hanging our hat on teleological stuff.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm just using it as one other string.
So one of the things, I don't know how much time we had.
About 2 minutes left.
2 minutes?
Oh, wow.
Last thing, before questions from the audience.
Yeah, so we'll get to questions here in a second. The thing is, I used to believe, and I don't anymore. And the primary reason that I don't believe is because I found that I was applying what is clearly insufficient standards of evidence as far as I'm concerned. That if I were to be honest and assess other claims under the same conditions that I assessed my version of Christianity and others, I couldn't do that. I would wind up having to believe all kinds of things that would end up being mutually exclusive. If I rely on I think these gospel authors were reliable and millions of people have believed this and it's been passed on, then if I were to apply that similarly, I would also have to accept the Quran, which actually we have copies that are closer to the original than we do for these. And then you would have to assess the content of those two to say, hang on, if this one's full of contradictions, it doesn't matter how accurate it is if this one's not. And yet you find contradictions all over the place, or at least problematic things. And most of the time, apologists write it off as, this isn't particularly relevant to salvation. And here's the thing. Even if there was a necessary God, I don't know anything about it other than it was necessary. I'm not convinced of that, but I wouldn't know anything else. I don't know what his plan is. I don't know how he intends to interact. I have no way of determining that he manifested through this particular individual. Certainly can't make that sort of conclusion based on, here's some writings that I generally find reliable, because that puts me in the position of saying, based on what I know and understand, this is the most reasonable explanation. And as I mentioned in the opening, that is flawed reasoning, because what I understand may be insufficient, and the inability to come up with a better explanation doesn't mean that I'm right, and I'd like to be right. So let's assume for a second, and you can finish this off, that I'm wrong, and there is some God. How does that impact me and my future?
Well, as far as a Christian understanding, there is a moral aspect to it. So I'm actually working on, as for my dissertation, I'm trying to come up with some sort of emotivist theory that sort of combines with divine command theory. And basically what I want to say is that each person actually has a way that they respond to certain moral events. They have certain moral responses to things. So at any given point in time, that particular set of moral responses objectively exists. It exists outside of my own mind, it's not contingent upon my own mind, so on and so forth. So each person has somewhat of, in a sense, an objective standard of morality. Now, the problem with morality in humans is that ours tend to change based on reason, experience, or ours is rather imperfect.
It's not the only thing that changes.
Sure.
The Bible advocates slavery. Almost everybody, including most Bible believers, are opposed to slavery, considered immoral.
Sure.
Okay.
How is that relevant to whether or not we should believe in God, though?
Well, I'm asking what the impact is if I don't believe in God.
Yes.
That,
Okay, so,
one of the things is
and that's what I was trying to get to,
impact,
though.
If there's
That's what I was
no
trying to answer.
impact, then it doesn't matter.
That's what I was trying to answer. So, what I want to say is that, and I'm still working on this. I'm literally going to write my dissertation on it. I'm not fixed on any one of these particular beliefs right now. I'm working on it. So, basically, I want to say that each person has an objective standard of morality that is sometimes changing, so on and so forth. If God exists, and if God has some sort of also has some sort of moral responses and decided to create us for a specific purpose, according to some sort of reasoning and morality that he has, and decides to judge us based on that sort of thing and send us to either heaven, hell, something of that nature, there is maybe some sort of pragmatic reason, but to believe it, maybe there is some sort of eternal component to it. I'm working on it.
Okay, let me cut us off at this point. Would you guys like to take a few minutes before we go to questions to collect ourselves, or should we go straight to questions here?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Straight to? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
That one is coming from a ton of people, and then also that one would be pretty good at that I just read it.
Okay. All right, here we go. I've got a question for both of you. It says, address the should we believe in God, not can we prove God exists, but should we believe? So
Yes.
is it better to believe, perhaps, I hear the question asking rather than about proof?
So I don't view this as something that would be tied to an is-ought problem on the should. For me, you should believe if you can reasonably demonstrate that it's true, and you should not believe if you cannot reasonably demonstrate that it's true. And I thought we were largely in agreement on that, and so that's why this discussion becomes about, is there good reason to believe? And if there is good reason, you should believe, and if there's not, you shouldn't.
I completely concur. And the only thing that I would add is I tried to provide a couple of arguments that, of course, we argued about a little bit. I try to provide some sort of historical data, and there's tons and tons of papers and books and written about this sort of thing, and you should go and, if this topic interests you, you really should try to figure it out for yourself as well. But I try to provide some sort of arguments, I try to provide some sort of historical reasons. I never actually really got into subjective belief and how that sort of formed, but you can talk to me afterwards, that's fine. But I would say that I tried to provide a reason for why I believed what I believe. And I can say that that's why I should believe, because I want to hold on to as many true beliefs and reject as many false beliefs as possible as well. And I met my threshold of belief to think that something is true, particularly belief in God. But that's where I'm at.
Okay. We have a question here about hope and faith. And Matt, I wanted to ask you, and I'm going to dovetail this with this question. You were pretty dismissive of the idea of faith in your discussion, with the idea that we should accept the null hypothesis until there is decisive or some kind of evidence, strong evidence for a belief. And I was going to ask, do we not tend to hold many beliefs that are sort of hopeful beliefs that perhaps are not supported by evidence, such as things will get better next year,
Sure.
Beliefs of this sort?
My children are the smartest children ever.
Above average. Is it not acceptable to have this kind of belief that's not supported by evidence if it is helping one in one's life? And this, I think, relates to this question, should I believe, is one allowed to take into account these practical and personal feelings and belief.
Yeah, I think those kinds of things fall into a couple different categories. I'm not opposed to hope and optimism. The thing is, I think that if somebody says, I can be anything I want to be, I'm not convinced that they actually believe that they can in fact be anything they want to be. They can't be 23 feet tall. What they're expressing is an optimism that is encouraging. And so you need to kind of distill what it is that you believe versus what it is you profess you believe. And certainly there's value. And I've said before, and I'll say here, prayer works. All the atheists just want to throw stuff at me right now. I don't mean that it works for any supernatural reason or any sort of appeal to God. My primary example is if you are trapped in a cave-in and you believe that there's a God and you begin to pray, you may calm down, use less oxygen, and extend the amount of time that people have to come and rescue for you for that. However, if you understand that that is the case, you don't need prayer and you don't need to give the prayer credit. You just need to understand these are the steps that I need to take in order to prolong the likelihood that I'm going to be rescued. So I try to be as precise as I can when I'm talking about things because we don't normally do that. We are the muddiest talkers and thinkers because everything's a shorthand. I assume if I say this word, you understand it, so let's just move on. And so when I say, first of all, on faith, I had the particular definition I talked about earlier because I'm convinced that is there any position that you couldn't feel justified merely on faith? Hey, white folks are better than black folks. I just take that on faith. Not only would I not take anything on faith, I'm definitely not taking that on faith. Oh, I take it on faith. I have strong confidence. I'm optimistic. I'm confident that whoever we just elected is going to be the best whatever we elected him to ever. Expressing a confidence, we'll make America great again. Express a confidence level. You can express a confidence level that is proportional to the evidence, and you can engage in hyperbole, and I don't feel that the hyperbole is warranted because any benefit you can derive from it, if you thought a little further and actually had evidence, you could justify it in the same way that calming down in the cave is going to save you just as quickly as prayer or prolong it.
Can I answer part of that?
Yeah, Philip, I don't think you mentioned faith in your discussion. What would you say about the role of faith and belief?
Well, so honestly, I think I don't have the same understanding of faith as Matt does. I can faith somewhat to trust. But that can still be based on reason and evidence. I don't believe in some sort of blind faith, but what I want to actually talk about is this nature of belief, in a sense, that part of Plantinga's account of warrant is that our beliefs, the way that we form beliefs has to be designed, or have to be, he does use the word design plan, it doesn't necessitate a God or anything, but anyway, they have to be aimed at producing true beliefs. And not all of our cognitive faculties, even though they are functioning properly, are always aimed at producing true beliefs. For example, I have my best friend in the crowd, right there. He has an irrational fear of spiders. He thinks every spider is like a death machine, and that belief, though, it's not formed on the basis of what's true. His belief is formed on the basis of survival. So his cognitive faculties, I think, are actually functioning properly, but the aim of those particular cognitive faculties, though functioning properly, are aimed at survival, not mere true belief. So for us to have some sort of knowledge or have warrant for our beliefs, they also have to be produced by cognitive faculties that are aimed at producing truth. We don't actually have to know that because it's an externalist kind of knowledge, and that's a whole big book that you guys should read.
Yeah, but the real question is his degree of concern about spiders warranted by the evidence?
No, that's why I said it's an irrational fear of beliefs.
I'm fine with the idea that we're going to have irrational
That's
beliefs.
why his belief lacks warrant, though, is because it's not based on something that has warrant for.
Sure.
It doesn't have, anyway, we agree.
Well, also, it is possible to do something good and useful with something that is not true. I'm concerned with whether or not it's true because if that's useful, whatever it is about it, if we find that the best way to achieve something is a lie, now we have a completely different dilemma, which is it still justified? Do the ends justify the means? But if we find out that it's not the lie that does it, but something that the lie does to your brain, and there's another way to do that that doesn't involve the lie, then you can go down that path.
Okay. For each of you, what kind of evidence would convince you that to change your mind or that your opponent is correct? What kind of new experience or evidence, if any, would convince either of you that to change your mind on this issue?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I talked about the modal ontological argument a lot, and we really got bogged down in it, and especially the first premise. I know that's the case, and that would warrant a much longer conversation I would love to have sometime. But I akin my belief in God to a degree of certainty at which I believe the logical absolutes and that 2 + 2 = 4. I cannot imagine a possible world in which 2 + 2 does not equal 4. There are no sorts of logical absolutes or something of that nature. This is because of the nature of what they are themselves. So I'm open. Don't get me wrong. I'm open that all my beliefs are false. I'm open to evidence and arguments to show that why I believe what I believe is wrong. Obviously, these are massive worldview changing beliefs that we hold. And nothing's going to get done in an hour and a half. They warrant much longer conversations. But I would say I don't know. I can't imagine a world where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. I can't imagine a world in which God doesn't exist. It's just something I can't do. I don't know.
I can't imagine a world where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 either. I don't put that on the same footing as whether or not a God exists, not remotely. Neither in the ability to demonstrate it, nor in whether or not we can intuit it. And also, just because I can't imagine a world where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, doesn't mean that somebody couldn't demonstrate a world where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. But the answer to what would change my mind is, I don't know. But for most definitions of God, if there is a God, that God knows exactly what would change my mind, that God is capable of changing my mind, and that God has not changed my mind, which means either that God does not exist or that God doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, not my problem.
Well, I'd like to say something about it. I've heard you say this a lot, and I think it's really clever, and it resonates well with crowds, and it sounds extremely right, but in fact, it's a false dichotomy. There are other options. It may very well be the case that you have completely closed your mind off to any possibility of accepting a belief in God. No evidence, no evidence, no experience, no argument, no nothing could ever convince you, because you've set your mind using your free will or something else. I think a lot actually hinges on free will.
Doesn't that make me more powerful than God if I can close myself off and prevent God from demonstrating existence?
If you misunderstand natures of logic and possibility, yes, that it would be the case. I think that you're
more powerful than God?
If you misunderstand logic and how it works.
Great being, if I am more powerful than God, doesn't that destroy your ontological argument?
Within maximally great being that gives you the ability to do the logically impossible. That's how freedom works. You can't force a free creature to freely choose something.
Yes, but I can demonstrate my existence to any creature with free will. There's a difference between me denying something and me being unconvinced of it. And the people who tend to, and no offense to you, but the people who tend to applaud for that particular line, which has come over and over again, they are convinced in their head, not that I don't believe that God exists. Mm-hmm. They are probably convinced that I am convinced, but I'm denying it. And there's no way to demonstrate that truth to you, but you are in fact wrong. I used to believe, I am no longer convinced, and I have yet to be offered any good reason to be convinced. And if in your head you are saying, Matt knows that God exists, Matt really believes, he's just stubborn and in denial, all you're doing is professing how confident you are in your idea of God, but you are not in any way approaching reason or rationality, and you are pretending that through the virtue of your religion, you can read my mind. And as somebody who pretends to read minds on stage for a living, I don't believe you can do that either. Ask your God to tell you what number I'm thinking of, and then we can talk.
Is it weird that I agree with everything you just said?
Yeah, no, it's fine, and I'm not trying to beat anybody up, and I appreciate it. No, I'm glad when people clap over that, because it allows me to make that point. I don't get to go say, oh, you really don't believe in God? You're just pretending that you believe in God to get along. I don't get to say that to anybody, and yet atheists get that all the time. And as someone who was a sincere believer, who was on my knees for 18 months begging God to give me any information or any sign in order to fulfill my obligation under 1 Peter 3:15 and be the preacher that I was convinced, my parents were convinced, and the members of my church were convinced he wanted me to be, and getting nothing but crickets, and then engaging for decades in these discussions where we get things like, God is a necessary being, how do you demonstrate that? Oh, here's all these arguments for the existence of God, which are logically flawed. For me, the God that I believed in, sincerely, was as evident as the tree outside. And then I figured out why that was wrong. That's it. If you don't believe that I'm not, you think I'm in denial or I'm closed off to God, I am open to being demonstrated the truth of any proposition, but there are limits. Because if I'm open to being demonstrated the truth of any proposition and my standards of evidence are so low that when I smuggle in the God of Christianity below that bar, I have to smuggle in 100 other things that contradict it, and I cannot do that and remain intellectually honest. And if that's not good enough for God, tough.
Matt, something you just said relates to another question here, which is what led you to decide that God doesn't exist after having been a believer and pursuing study to become a preacher?
That's actually good, because it's not necessarily the case that an atheist is someone who is convinced God doesn't exist. If you're convinced that God exists, you're a theist. If you are not convinced, you're an atheist. You can also be convinced. I use a courtroom example. We address the assertion of guilt. Is God guilty of existing? If you are a theist, if you say, yes, God's guilty of existing. If you say not guilty, that doesn't mean you are necessarily convinced that gods don't exist or any God doesn't exist. It just means you are unconvinced that God does in fact exist, because the burden of proof is on the claim of God's existence. The null hypothesis is that no God, no thing exists until such time as there is reasonable warrant to conclude that it does. You have to defeat the null hypothesis. So what I figured out, I didn't start with a God belief and then end up with, I've now concluded there are no gods. I started with a belief in God and found out why that belief wasn't warranted and could not. I didn't give it up. I cannot. I don't choose what I believe. I am no longer convinced. It's that simple.
Philip, for you, I think you had mentioned the problem of evil as one that had led you to question your belief previously. This isn't a point that Matt brought up to try to give evidence against the existence of God, but I'm wondering how you would answer that frequent challenge by atheists, which is, why is there so much misery in the world if there is a supremely perfect being?
Sure, so I didn't actually hear Matt give that argument.
No, you mentioned it very, very briefly, POE.
Right. So that's not actually what caused me to question my belief in God. That's actually what caused me to try to figure out whether or not I could provide a reason for my belief in God. It's what led me to just try to figure things out, truth, God, and reality, and my place in the world, and so on and so forth. Really, the point that I've got at now, because I'm still trying to work on the nature of free will and how it sort of works in terms of morality, it's something I'm still working on. So I know that there is no explicit contradiction within a all-powerful, all-loving being existing and evil existing. There's no explicit contradiction in the terms, which is why the logical problem of evil typically isn't defended any longer. But it's something I'm working on. I don't know exactly why yet. I'm still trying to deal with the emotional problem of evil. I just don't know. Still working on it.
Yeah, it's not explicit. It may be implicit in loving, depending on how you define it, and benevolence.
Maybe that's what I'm working on.
I don't think it'll surprise you to know. I'm not a big fan of the problem of evil theodicy. I don't find that to be a particularly compelling argument, defeater for God, for me. Because, first of all, I was a Southern Baptist for 25 years. Hey, God's got some plan. Everything works together for God's good. You know, of course bad things are going to happen. We're sinful creatures. Adam and Eve sinned, brought sin into the world. It's our fault. I don't buy any of that. But I also feel that the problem of evil isn't particularly convincing to a wide range of believers, and it is primarily an emotional appeal. It gets to the, if God loves us and wants what's good for us, why do babies get cancer? And I don't I realize that there may in fact, depending on your definition of God and what model you think God has for the world, there may in fact be some substance there that could demonstrate that this God doesn't exist or isn't good or isn't useful, whatever. I don't tend to use it because I am worried that if it were to convince somebody to give up their belief and the reason why was bad, like they just got mad at God for allowing, cancer or whatever else, that's not the reason I want people to give up belief in a God. To the extent that I want people to give up belief in a God, I want it to be founded on reason and an understanding of the null hypothesis, where the burden of proof rests, what evidentiary standards we should have. Because I have no problem with appealing to humanity and who we are. I have no problem pointing out that the Bible's view on slavery is in conflict with morality. I do it all the time. But this idea that, why do bad things happen to good people? Yes, I think a more reasonable explanation is because the universe doesn't give a damn about us and that we're doing the best we can, but it doesn't actually serve as a defeater for God. And because there are so many versions of God, even within Christianity, about what sort of model some individual thinks. If you want to find out what's wrong with the Second Baptist Church, you can go to the First Baptist Church, and they'll tell you. And you only have to go to the third pew to find out what's wrong with the people in the first pew. I lived this, I know it. And I'm not knocking it because none of that has anything to do with God, but it is about us. And I have concerns if we make arguments that are about our clear, flawed understanding, which we have irrespective of whether or not there's a God. None of us are perfect thinkers, as far as I'm aware. And if there was a perfect thinker, I already know I'm not perfect, so I couldn't identify it anyway.
I wanted to get back to the question that came up a little bit in the debate, where it was mentioned there are these different arguments that Phil gave and that Matt was responding to, and how do we think about the combination of the four arguments or so that I heard, because it sounds like maybe, with the exception of the ontological argument, maybe even the ontological argument, it was said that each of these may give some evidence that may show that it's, say, a 50% chance. I know we didn't say anything that exact, I don't think, that God exists. And Matt, I heard you say, well, wait, if you give several different 50s, that takes away that the new argument is so 50% of the old 50, but it seems to me that somehow the sum of the arguments should be cumulative, not 50 plus 50 to get to 100, but I know 50 plus 50 are we up to 75% of the other 50 that the first didn't work. I'm not sure, but don't the sum of those arguments add up to additional evidence? And then, I guess, Phillip, would you say this as well? So to both of you, how do you make, what do you make of the way the different evidence combines?
So I think the nature of arguments is really interesting. Whenever we're trying to, one of the best ways that I like to use arguments, and the reason that I think they're incredibly important, is primarily to answer for defeaters for my belief. So whenever I form my belief, I'm still open to opposing views. I'm still open to figuring out the way that I came to my belief, why it's wrong. So these arguments are used to try to answer for defeaters that I've come up with in my studies. And each time I get a new argument, and it turns out that I think there's good evidence to think that it's true, and I'm doing the best that I can, then I think it does add a sort of layer of coherence. It adds to the coherence of the idea of what you're trying to talk about anyway.
There's this idea that if we had multiple lines of evidence, that we were, let's say, 90%, we were 90% confident in each of them, that having multiple lines of evidence pointing towards the same conclusion, that we're consistently 90% or 90, 80% or whatever else, that the fact that there are multiple lines with high confidence lends credence to the idea that we are probably on the right path. But if we're trying to look at these and say, how confident are we? If what we add is fractions over and over again, we can never be more confident than we are in our most confident thing, which is why sometimes on the show, I think Jeff D started doing it, which is, somebody would present an argument, and then we would point out what the problem was in the argument. And then rather than acknowledge the argument was defeated, or that, it wasn't good or reliable, they would just say, yeah, but, and then go on to the next one, the next one. And this is why Jeff was starting to say, just give me your best argument first, because if your best argument is insufficient, then none of the rest of them can be better than this. And when you start multiplying fractions, you know,
Yeah.
you decrease the overall confidence level, even though the multiple lines may be pointing to something.
So,
And the problem is establishing a confidence level that you can show.
right, so I know you're familiar with Susan Hack and chain of belief and how that sort of works. And if you have unjustified beliefs and each one is, even if you have a belief that you think is justified by the previous belief and the previous belief and the previous belief and the previous belief, there's only 4 ways in which that can stop. It doesn't just keep on going. If you arrive at a belief that is unjustified itself, then the entire chain is unjustified. If you arrive at a belief that is, if it just keeps on going, a whole bunch of unjustified beliefs, then your whole chain is unjustified.
There's a problem, though, with the God proposition. This is what, so I've debated a bunch of issues. I debated abortion. You can't use analogies because there's nothing analogous to it. Everything's going to fail. Analogies are always going to fail. The problem with the God thing is it is going to be consistent with any unknown that you can find. Why did this happen? Because if God is capable of doing anything, then God is capable of filling any gap in our understanding. And so if we have something where we don't know what it is, and somebody says, I'm convinced that there's a God, and God would be a sufficient explanation for this, the question is it a necessary explanation? Do we have a way to confirm that this is in fact the explanation? Because I can shuffle up a deck of cards and I can deal them out, and it's 1 in 500 million or something that you would get all 13 of the spades. If it happened, it's more likely that I cheated. But can you reasonably conclude that that is in fact the case, especially when we know in bridge tournaments, even though there have not been enough bridge games played for this to cover the possibilities, it has happened at least once that's been recorded. Now, I'm not saying you need to be absolutely certain, but if we sat down at a table and you got those cards, are you going to accuse me of cheating? Are you going to pull out a knife and, like the Old West style? Maybe I cheated, maybe I didn't. That example, I think we have good reason to conclude that perhaps I cheated. I'm a magician, I cheated, all right. On the other hand, it's still possible, both logically possible and empirically possible, that we could shuffle those cards up and that's what you get. If you propose that a God that could possibly serve as an explanation for anything, then it's an explanation for nothing. It's a cornucopia. It has no explanatory power. We address the unknown by appealing to the known. If we try to resolve the unknown by appealing to the further unknown, you're trying to solve a mystery with a bigger mystery. And you're not solving anything, you're not explaining anything, you're not edifying anybody's understanding. All you're doing is saying, this is where we're going to stop questioning and just say, it's God.
Well, so oddly enough, I agree with
I knew that, but
I mean, that's why I recognize that each of the arguments, most of the arguments, maybe there's a couple that I believe that I think are self-justified in a way. Most of the arguments don't necessarily lead to a theological conclusion or a conclusion that there's God or something of that nature. I completely recognize that. So, I don't know, maybe I'm just concurring. No point in me adding to it.
and I think we agree on this too. If you were to construct a logical syllogism, and it's valid and sound, then the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion.
Definitely.
I want a syllogism for God.
I'll work on that.
I want it.
Okay.
That's the thing, and maybe this will touch on something we did before for the people who think that I'm just closed off. Like I said, there's no way for me to convince you. I will be doing an event with the amazing Randy, who's part of the JRAF, who had $1 million prize testing for the paranormals. Nobody ever managed to demonstrate anything paranormal, even in the preliminary tests. Skepticism is not about saying no, 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 no. It's not about being a cynic. It's not about debunking. If somebody says, hey, I can douse for water, our goal is not to say, no, you can't. It's to say, go for it. And continually, they fail to demonstrate that they can do what they say they do. The skeptic community doesn't say that ghosts, goblins, dowsing, psychics, tea leaf readers, we don't say that they're they're necessarily frauds unless we can demonstrate that this is the case. We don't say that that can't happen. What we say is, on this day, in this way, this individual failed to demonstrate it, and this is the trend, and until the trend is overcome, we cannot have good reason to believe it. And just because you offer up an unfalsifiable proposition doesn't mean that it gets the benefit of the doubt. It's not the failing of critical thinking, science, and skepticism that your proposition that you accept is ultimately unfalsifiable.
So I want to add just two quick things. The proposed God that you can propose in the ontological argument or something, it is a falsifiable claim. You show a contradiction in terms, you have logical impossibility, and it doesn't follow through modal logic.
The problem is that the fact that there isn't a contradiction in terms doesn't necessarily mean that it's falsifiable. So the null hypothesis is always a statement that is in fact falsifiable. Okay, but you can make a claim that's unfalsifiable without any contradiction that we're aware of. And the first premise of the ontological, not to beat it up, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. And what I'm saying is, I'm not aware that possible and exist aren't actually a contradiction that we're not aware of. And we don't just get to assume it's not a contradiction.
I think it's something that I'd love to have a conversation on, and maybe some
Beer?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not a beer guy. I just say that because everybody wants to go out for beer now. Or some of you.
The other thing that I wanted to say, I thought about the question, you want a syllogism for God? There's a reason that Alvin Plantinga rejects the high importance of natural theology in arguments for God. It's because arguments don't necessarily line up with the way things really are. No argument at all. So I can give you a syllogism that God exists, but it doesn't mean it's sound.
I asked for a sound one specifically, but...
Right, but the problem is soundness is one of these really odd concepts that change. It's really
I agree.
This is his complaint of natural theology or syllogisms in general. It doesn't necessitate that it actually matches up to the world. Now, if the premises are true and those actually obtain in reality, then it does necessitate it. But that sort of thing is nearly impossible to prove.
Let me ask one more question. I wanted to bring up agnosticism and as an option for both of you. Now, Matt, I just understood you today to defend why one shouldn't but necessarily believe, so that could be agnosticism or atheism. Now, your radio show is the Atheist experience. I'm wondering if the arguments you use that we should accept the null hypothesis would also lead one to reject atheism and say, I don't know whether God exists or not, so until it's proven one way or another, and I'm not sure what would prove the non-existence, but what should we all be agnostic?
Agnosticism and atheism aren't mutually exclusive. Atheism and theism address what you believe. Gnosticism and agnosticism address what you know or claim to know. Knowledge is a subset of belief, so you can be an agnostic atheist. This is why when I used the example about the courtroom, atheism is not, there is no God. If you were to assert there is no God, you would be adopting a burden of proof, and you would need to demonstrate this. You would need to present why you are in fact convinced that there is no God, and you may be able to convince people. I have talked about this many times. There's a reason why in debates I don't show up and adopt that position. It's because it unnecessarily shifts the burden of proof away from what the null hypothesis is, which is you cannot be convinced that there's a God. You can also not be convinced that there's not a God until it's met its burden of proof. That's it. Agnosticism, so there's this idea that there's a middle ground. There's no middle ground between I believe and I do not believe. None. There is a middle ground between I believe this and I believe that, and that is to not believe either. There's no middle ground between I am convinced and I'm not convinced. They are, anytime you stick a not in front of anything, that's non-contradiction. It's the end of this thing. Also, and I know you're aware of this because you watched the video, but what Alvin Plantinga has said about his own ontological argument, which I wondered kind of what your thought is since you're convinced. He said, our verdict on these reformulation versions of St. Anselm's argument must be as follows. They cannot, perhaps said, to prove or establish their conclusion, But since it is rational to accept their central premise, they do show that it is rational to accept the conclusion.
Sure.
We agree that if you accept the premises, you should accept the conclusion. But it seems that Plantinga is acknowledging that there's no way to establish that first premise that you accept.
So that's Plantinga's complaint against all arguments, and I simply disagree on arguments that deal with modal logic.
Okay.
And that's a conversation that maybe Plantinga and I could have. I would love to do my PhD under him, but he doesn't teach anymore, and it makes me sad.
Oh.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the audience showing, and especially our two speakers, Phillip, Matt. Please do vote with your donation for who won.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.